The young Hegelians had already unsettled religious debate, but journalism in the Rhineland required another sort of courage. A paper did not argue only with scholars. It argued with ministries, provincial officials, police regulations, landowners, merchants, and readers who paid attention because the issue touched their own lives. Marx's work began to acquire a harder edge. Freedom of the press was no longer only a philosophical right. It was the condition under which society might become visible to itself. The state understood this visibility as danger. Friedrich Wilhelm IV had come to the Prussian throne in 1840 with hopes among some liberals that his reign might soften censorship and allow constitutional reform. Those hopes thinned as the decade moved on. The monarchy was willing to speak the language of Christian kingship and historical mission, but not to surrender the instruments of political control. In the Rhineland, where memories of French law and local autonomy still mattered, this tension was especially sharp. The Rheinische Zeitung became a place where that tension entered print. Marx's editorial work did not make him a democrat in the ordinary parliamentary sense alone. It made him suspicious of the gap between formal discussion and real power. When deputies debated the interests of forest owners while poor families remained outside the chamber, the shape of representation itself became questionable. When censorship allowed certain forms of criticism and blocked others, public opinion became less than fully public. When a newspaper depended on investors who feared suppression, even radical print remained tied to property. These lessons would deepen later, but their outline had begun to form in Cologne. The practical details of the office carried their own pressure. Articles had to be written, revised, and prepared for publication. News arrived unevenly. Warnings from officials could alter what appeared before readers ever saw it. The paper's financial position depended on circulation, confidence, and the willingness of shareholders to endure risk. Marx's life in these months was not the life of a professor arranging lectures at a measured pace. It was faster, more exposed, and more entangled with daily consequence. The philosopher was learning the tempo of public conflict. That tempo soon became unsustainable. The authorities decided that the Rheinische Zeitung had become too troublesome. Censorship grew stricter, and the paper was ordered to close in 1843. Marx resigned before the final suppression took effect, partly because the worsening restrictions made serious work impossible. The closure was a defeat, but it was also a clarification. Prussia had taught him that public criticism could be tolerated only within limits set by the very power being criticized. For a mind already impatient with half measures, this was not likely to produce moderation. The end of the paper changed Marx's private life as well. In June 1843, he married Jenny von Westphalen after years of engagement and waiting. Their marriage began without the secure career that Heinrich Marx might once have imagined for his son. Jenny entered a life that would soon be marked by movement, surveillance, and financial uncertainty. This should not be treated as a romantic ornament beside the political story. It belonged to the story itself, because Marx's public choices would repeatedly become household conditions, and the price of his intellectual independence would often be paid in domestic strain. Cologne had given Marx his first real confrontation with the modern state as an editor rather than a student. It had also given him the first clear signs that questions of law and freedom could not be separated from property and class. The wood theft debates had shown him poor people made visible only when they violated ownership. The censor had shown him that public reason could be managed by administrative routine. The newspaper's suppression had shown him how fragile liberal criticism remained when it depended on permission. With the Rheinische Zeitung gone, Germany no longer seemed wide enough for the work Marx wanted to do. Paris drew him next, not as a romantic escape, but as a city where German philosophy, French socialism, working-class politics, and exile journalism might meet in the same streets. Jenny went with him into that uncertain beginning, and the young editor who had learned from censorship now moved toward a larger, noisier world, where he would meet the friend who changed the scale of everything he wrote. Chapter 4. Paris. Jenny, and the friendship that changed the work. The closing of the Rheinische Zeitung did not merely end a newspaper, it pushed Karl Marx beyond the political limits of Prussia. He had learned in Cologne that criticism inside Germany could be delayed, trimmed, watched, and finally silenced by administrative order, and the lesson made a different kind of work necessary. Paris offered what Cologne could not. It held German exiles, French socialists, political clubs, workers' associations, poets, publishers, and arguments that moved with a freedom Prussian censorship would not have allowed. When Marx arrived there in 1843 with Jenny, newly married and already tied to a precarious future, exile began as a form of punishment, but it also became an education. Jenny Marx entered Paris, not as the wife of a famous man, because Marx was not yet famous in any broad sense. She had married a brilliant, unsettled radical whose prospects had narrowed rather than improved since their engagement. The move cost her the familiar security of Trier and the social world into which she had been born. In Paris, she lived among uncertain income, political visitors, foreign languages, and the early pressure of a household that would rarely know ease. Her place in the story belongs here, near the beginning of exile, because Marx's public life did not unfold apart from domestic risk. It carried that risk with it, from city to city. Paris in the 1840s was not only a capital of art and pleasure, it was a capital of argument. The memory of the French Revolution still lived in political language, and the more recent revolutions of 1830 had left behind disappointed republicans, workers, journalists, and conspirators who still believed that France's future had not settled. German émigrés gathered there because the city gave them a breathing space. French socialist thought offered alternatives to the liberal constitutionalism of men like Heinrich Marx. In cafes, reading rooms, private apartments, and editorial offices, Marx encountered a world where politics was no longer simply a dispute over censorship and legal reform. It had become a question of labor, poverty, property, and the organization of society itself. Arnold Ruge joined Marx in the attempt to publish the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, a journal meant to bring German philosophical criticism and French political energy into contact. Only one double issue appeared, but its short life was still important. Marx's essays there showed the movement of his thought away from the language of pure political emancipation and toward the social conditions beneath political rights. His critique of Hegel's philosophy of right and his essay on the Jewish question belonged to this phase, when he was trying to understand why formal equality before the state could coexist with inequality in ordinary life. The question was not yet answered in the mature terms of capital, but the direction had changed. The phrase political emancipation no longer seemed large enough. The Constitution could grant rights, a state could recognize citizens, and public law could speak in universal terms, yet people still lived inside property relations, religious inheritance, wage dependence, and social exclusion. Marx's early Paris writings pressed against that gap. They were difficult, compressed, and often severe, but behind their severity lay a problem that many people could recognize in simpler language. Public freedom did not always reach the places where daily life was actually arranged. A person might be equal before the law and still powerless before rent, employer, hunger, or debt. Heinrich Heine was one of the notable German figures in Paris, and his presence gave the exile world a literary brilliance as well as a political one. Heine had the wit, melancholy, and European range of a writer who understood both the charm and danger of radical hopes. Marx knew him and admired him, though admiration did not mean complete likeness. Heine's world was lyrical, ironic, and wounded. Marx's was becoming harder, more systematic, and less willing to let contradiction remain a matter of elegant suffering. Still, the connection shows the richness of Marx's Paris. He did not live among economists alone. He moved through a city where poetry, police surveillance, philosophy, and working-class politics could meet within a few streets. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon also belonged to the Parisian world Marx encountered. Proudhon, already famous for declaring property to be theft, had a reputation among workers and radicals that no German philosopher could ignore. He wrote with force, paradox, and a craftsman's suspicion of centralized authority. Marx first treated him with interest, and for a time Proudhon seemed to represent a serious attempt to think beyond bourgeois property without merely repeating older utopian schemes. Their later quarrel would be sharp, but in Paris, Proudhon mattered because he showed Marx a form of socialism rooted less in German philosophy than in French social criticism and artisan experience. During these months, Marx also wrote the manuscripts, later known as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. They were not published in his lifetime, and this gives them a slightly unusual place in his story. They were private working papers, not finished public doctrine, yet they reveal a mind trying to join philosophy, labor, property, and human estrangement into one field of thought. Marx wrote about alienated labor, the worker separated from the product, from the act of work, from other human beings, and from the fullness of human powers. The language remained philosophical, but the subject had moved toward the workshop, the wage, and the conditions under which people made things they did not own. A manuscript can sometimes preserve a thinker more honestly than a polished book. In these Paris notebooks, Marx had not yet built the full machinery of his later economics, and for that reason the searching quality is visible. He was reading political economy, especially British and French writers, but he was reading them through the questions inherited from Hegel and Feuerbach. What did labor mean for human life? What happened when labor became external to the worker? How could wealth grow while the person producing it became poorer in power and dignity? The questions were still larger than the answers, and that imbalance gave the manuscripts their restless force. Friedrich Engels entered this world with a different education. He was the son of a textile manufacturer, raised in a commercial family, and sent to Manchester to work in the family firm. There, he had seen industrial capitalism not as an abstraction, but as streets, mills, workers' districts, factory discipline, smoke-darkened buildings, and the hard arithmetic of wages. His observations would soon become The Condition of the Working Class in England, a book that gave German radical thought a direct encounter with British industrial life. Engels had already met Marx briefly before, but the serious meeting came in Paris in 1844, and it changed both men's lives. The importance of that meeting is easier to see from its result than from any dramatic scene. Two young radicals, both in their 20s, discovered that their separate paths had begun to converge. Marx brought philosophical severity, historical ambition, and a growing critique of political economy. Engels brought knowledge of British industry, practical acquaintance with commerce, and a political radicalism sharpened by Manchester. Their conversation lasted for days, and afterward the collaboration did not fade. A friendship formed that became intellectual, political, financial, and personal, with consequences reaching through the rest of Marx's life. This friendship should not be flattened into the simple story of a patron and a genius. Engels did become the material support without which Marx's work would have been nearly impossible, but he was also a thinker, writer, organizer, and collaborator in his own right. He understood things Marx needed to understand, especially the industrial world that Britain displayed more fully than the continent. Marx, in turn, gave Engels a partner whose theoretical power could gather scattered observations into a far larger critique. Their temperaments differed, and their circumstances differed even more. But the bond rested on recognition. Each found in the other not agreement alone, but completion of a task neither could have carried in the same way alone. The first fruit of the partnership appeared in polemical writing against figures they believed represented inadequate forms of criticism. The Holy Family, directed largely against Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians, showed Marx and Engels turning away from the old circle of philosophy